I'm so excited to be with you guys here this morning, and I've got some really exciting things to share with you. I've really been on this quest for, goodness, probably over 20 years ago when I was an undergrad student in archaeology. Of course, I went to a secular school, and going to a secular school, you don't get the conservative answer to your questions about the Bible, as you may be aware. So I remember being in class, and the course I was taking was, I took a lot of courses, my degree's in archaeology, but one of the courses I took was a history of the ancient Near East. And they didn't really even talk about the Exodus, but I remember after class I went up and talked to my professor about, is there any evidence for the Exodus? If we hadn't talked about the Exodus, is there any evidence for it? And he goes, there's really, the dating doesn't fit, and it's just, there's not a lot. Now, I became a Christian when I was 9 years old, and I sort of thought, well, what do you mean there's no evidence for the Exodus? There's no evidence for the Bible? And so he pointed to the chapter I should read. I read the chapter, and sure enough, the scholars are saying in the book that just doesn't fit. So that led me on a quest, and which really is a long story in of itself. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but the quick answer is that basically that question, when I was a student, led me into find answers in the library at Mississippi State. Actually, I discovered a book by Josh McDowell. And Josh was quoting an archaeologist by the name of Nelson Gleck, who was a colleague of William F. Albright, who I discovered and then was the founding father of American Biblical Archaeology. And so that eventually led me into studying apologetics, which led me to Charlotte, North Carolina, which, gosh, years ago, and when Dr. Norm Geisler, who many of you know, he's now with the Lord now, but Dr. Geisler was a colleague of, some of you may know who this is, John Warwick Montgomery. I think Dr. Montgomery was at Trinity for a while. Brilliant guy. Dr. Montgomery's still around. So I was mentored by Norm Geisler and along with Frank Turek. Frank was there first, and then I came, and then Frank and I became good friends. And if you know who Frank Turek is, you know I worked for Frank for about 3 years, but I've known Frank for over 20-something years because he's kind of like a big brother. You know, he's a few years older than me, but I know Frank and his sons and his wife Stephanie, work with them very closely. So just anyway, that's kind of my background. So that's really started me on the quest. But let me just say, as a blanket statement, that what I have discovered, this is, if you're studying archaeology in the Bible, I've traveled down every road, I've looked down every avenue, and I'm just telling what I'm going to present to you today is my view in the best historical and archaeological evidence for the Exodus and Conquest. Now, that's a tall order to try to fill in just a few minutes to try to cover the Exodus and Conquest, and I don't think I can do it. But you're going to get inundated with a lot of facts and a lot of information. So it's going to be like drinking from a fire hydrant. So I just forewarn you as we get into the material this morning. The question is, in a lot of the social media posts, has archaeology disproved the Bible? Well, the short answer is no, but we need to talk about a couple of things here. Number one, what is archaeology and what it can do? This question here, question number two, is actually a question, it's actually the title of a book by Dr. Bill Deaver, former professor of archaeology at the University of Arizona, and his graduate student is another friend of mine. He's also now a professor down at Mississippi State, Dr. James Harden. I call him Jimmy, but I got to think his technical title, James Harden. What did the biblical writers know, and when did they know it? That's a very, very important question. And then number three, what are archaeology's three functions as it relates to the biblical text? Let's jump right in. Talk about archaeology. Archaeology is simply a scientific investigation of the past by analyzing the material remains of past human cultures. So as archaeologists, what we care about, you can talk about conjecture all day long, but you got to base it up with facts. We want hard evidence. So it is a scientific discipline. So it's a study of the past by studying the material remains. The emphasis here is on material of past human cultures and includes the recovery, the cataloging, the analyzing, and the interpretation of artifacts. So archaeology is a broad subject that includes a lot of different phases for the archaeology. What most people think about archaeology, they think about going over there like Indiana Jones with their Indy hat, with their whip, and they think about the recovery. But there's a whole lot to it. In fact, majority of really where the good science comes in archaeology is in the lab. So when we're in the laboratory is when we discover some amazing things. And I'll give you one quick example that was just recently. The artifact itself was recovered in 1967, but it wasn't until last year in the laboratory that it came out what it was, and it came out on the news. I published this on Epic Archaeology on Facebook. We did a little thing on it. Does anybody know what famous New Testament person, additional evidence, we already had other evidence that he existed, historical evidence, but what new additional evidence, and Kevin, you know, so you can't answer the question, but what new evidence, and I'll give you a hint, his name sort of sounds like what you would do to fly an airplane. Pilate. Pontius Pilate. They found his signet ring. Now, it was recovered in 1967, but it was in a laboratory that a curator, a lab assistant, actually eventually took the high-resolution photographs. They found the writing on it. They deciphered the writing, and it actually contains the name of Pontius Pilate. It was discovered at a site called Herodion, which was one of the fortresses, palace fortresses that Herod the Great built in the 1st century A.D. So it's an amazing artifact. So this is an example of how all this works together. And I think about archaeology this way. In fact, I always, when I give presentations and I teach, I always try to think of new ways to help people understand this science of archaeology. Imagine, you guys know, old enough to know, you remember a long time, and I just turned 50 this year, so I know it too. You remember the old Polaroid pictures you took and the little thing came out and you carried it, you like wave it around in the air to develop? Well, archaeology is sort of like a Polaroid camera, except in a few seconds, it takes years. It will take 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years down the road until the complete picture sort of fills in the gap. So, but what we have, the information that we have so far, the picture that's been developing for years is really coming to focus, and we're seeing some really remarkable things that I'm going to share with you today. So, does that make sense? Is that a good analogy to think about, like a slow developing picture? The second thing is history, and I want to make a distinction here between archaeology and history. Although there is a lot of cross-pollination, there is a formal distinction between archaeology and history. Whereas an archaeologist will study the past by using material artifacts, a historian studies the past by looking at historical records, written records or texts. It could be manuscripts, papyri, it could be ostraca, which is a piece of pottery with writing on it. It could be an engraved tablet, a temple wall, a palace wall. You get the idea. So historians are interested in text. They're not necessarily interested in artifacts. Now, where this crosses over is when you have an artifact that has writing on it. Well, in that case, we call that then a historical inscription. And so that would be, so if we have a historical inscription, then that is of interest not only to archaeologists, but also to historians as well. And there's a very famous historical inscription that was found in 1799. You all know what that is. It was found by the French back during the era of Napoleon Bonaparte. And what was that? The Rosetta Stone, exactly. And it was an inscription that was a historical artifact, but it was also an archaeological artifact as well. So are we clear on that? It's a very good distinction to make. So what are the three functions of archaeology? And I'm going to get through this pretty quick because I want to get to the Exodus. Number three, and this is what I've been teaching for about 14 or 15 years. It has three functions. Archaeology can affirm, it can illuminate, and it can clarify the text. Notice that I didn't say prove. So when you're talking about proof, we need to define what we mean by the word prove. People ask me all the time on radio interviews and podcasts, has archaeology proved the Bible? Yeah, I don't like that word. I also have a degree in philosophy, so I'm very hesitant to use the word proof. So when I think about proof, I think about like a mathematical proof or some type of math equation, like an algebra equation. So archaeology is not like that. If you're looking for 100% certainty, you're not going to get it in archaeology. But it does yield probable evidence. So based on inductive reasoning, we gather the evidence, and sort of archaeology is a cumulative case. So we build up the case over time, we gather the evidence, and so archaeology can affirm the historical basis of the Bible. And in the other two, most people, in fact, most secular archaeologists would agree that archaeology definitely illuminates the text and clarifies the text as well. You may or may not know this, but in biblical studies today, you got, and Bob was mentioning just a minute ago, the conference coming up here in the Chicagoland area in October next month, in which they're going to talk about gospel differences. Well, you've got New Testament scholars and Old Testament scholars. You would think, now, don't make this assumption, but you would think that somebody who is a scholar studying the New Testament would want to know what the archaeology is. And you know what? That's not necessarily the case. It may surprise you that many New Testament scholars and Old Testament scholars don't study archaeology. I'm not making that's the fact. That's the facts. And many archaeologists don't study Old Testament studies or New Testament studies. You would think that they would. Why is that the case? That's a whole other discussion. But the quick answer is that that synthesis, the idea that you can actually be holistic in the way you look at the Bible, is known as the Albright Wright School of Archaeology, and it was a very broad way of looking at it. He not only William F. Albright not only looked at the archaeology, he also looked at the linguistics, the paleography, what the text said, the theology, all of it together. And today, archaeology and scholarship has become very, very specialized. You have your little area of specialty, and that's all you focus on, and you're an expert in this one little area, whereas in the past, 40, 50 years ago, you would actually look at all of it together. So I hope that makes sense. So it can affirm the text. The Exodus and Conquest, huge. I would say in the Old Testament, and I'm an Old Testament guy, I love the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, I would say not Genesis 1, although that's important. I know our friends at AIG would probably say that's the foundation. It is pretty important. I'm not dissing that. But I would say that in the Old Testament, the Exodus and Conquest is one of the most pivotal events, because most of the rest of the Old Testament, you look at the prophets, you look at all the other people, they're all reverting back to the Exodus. Remember what God did? Remember what God did then? God, brought us out of Egypt. Here's the question, though: did it really happen? And of course, we've seen the movies. Everybody loves the Ten Commandments. And I'll just say my favorite Pharaoh was Yul Brynner, who played Ramses. And I'll go ahead and tell you now, Ramses II was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But he does make a cool-looking Pharaoh, though. I will say that. And then the most recent example was, this is Batman playing Moses, Christian Bale. And I have not seen this one yet. This was actually Gods and Kings. I think it was a Ridley Scott, the guy that did Alien. Was it Ridley Scott? I forgot the director. It's either Ridley Scott or, I think it's Ridley Scott who directed it. But I heard it was pretty bad. So the question is, did it really happen, though? That's the question. Did it really happen? Is there any evidence that the Exodus happened? And that's what we're going to look at today. Now, here's a scholar today, just to give you a little sampling of what people think about the Exodus today, what Old Testament scholars think about the Exodus. This is a scholar named by the name of Baruch Halpern. And this is in a book published several years ago, edited by Herschel Shanks. The name of the book is The Rise of Ancient Israel. And basically, in this quote here, Halpern, just so you know the discussion, he's essentially comparing the Exodus with the Odyssey written by Homer. That's the conversation he's talking about. And so basically he says, in both cases, there is evidence that a peculiar process of oral transmission in which the story of the Exodus is renegotiated with each separate audience each time it is told. Each story reflects a healthy admixture of fancy with whatever is being recalled. The Odyssey is basically a piece of children's literature, he says. So in its way, the story is the story of the Exodus. It is the historical myth of an entire people, a focal point of national identity. The actual evidence concerning the Exodus resembled the evidence for a unicorn. Wow. So, this is what one of the top scholars in the world thinks. Not, I won't say top, but he's indicative of what people today think. Here are a few other scholars that you may or may not have heard of who are skeptical of the Exodus. Thomas Thompson, Niles Peter Lemke, John Van Cedars at UNC Chapel Hill, Donald Redford, and William Deaver, and then finally Israel Finkelstein, who is an archaeologist. These top three guys there, Thompson, Lemke, and Van Cedars, are part of a school of archaeology or historical scholarship called the Copenhagen School of Old Testament Studies. And primarily, the first two guys are out of Copenhagen, Denmark. But basically what the view is that you can't trust anything in the Old Testament, and especially things like the Exodus and Conquest, because they have all these great miracles like, the Nile turning to blood and all this crazy stuff like that. And we know we can't believe in that kind of stuff. But basically, it's just bad philosophy. It's just self-referential absurdity. Like these three guys, the top two guys, they wrote a book about 400 or 500 pages long telling us why we can't trust language. That language cannot be trusted. I'm like, okay, teacher, can I just trust anything you just said? Oh, and here's why you can't trust it, because once it becomes history, then it's open to interpretation, and we can't know the author's intent. I'm like, so now the book's 20 years old, so now I can't know. I can just make it mean whatever I want it to mean. So it's self-referentially absurd, basically. It's postmodern. It's exactly what it is. It's postmodern philosophy in biblical scholarship. So if you don't think philosophy affects science and history and archaeology, you're wrong. It does. Science or philosophy affects everything. I did a debate with Bob Price. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a Jesus mythicist. He also wrote a book against the Exodus. So if you want to see that debate, you can go to my website, epicarchaeology.org, and click on the blog, and then you scroll down the blog, and then the Exodus debate, and you can see the debate there. It was actually on the Unbelievable podcast with Justin Brierley out of the UK. So check that out later if you want to hear about an hour-long debate on it. So let's get into the discussion about this issue of Israel. Was there ever an ancient Israel to begin with? Is this just something that was made up? Let me give you the emergence. Basically, this is the theory today that scholars pretty much hold to as to the origins of Israel. Now, in this church, and probably in your church, you will probably hear a sermon on ancient Israel. But I'm telling you, most modern scholars doubt that they ever existed, and if they did, here are the different theories as to their origins. These are all, by the way, non-conquest and non-Exodus models. So because they reject the historical Exodus, and really if you think about it, the Exodus and the conquest is really the birthplace of Israel. Now, someone could say, well, it started with Abraham, but really, when you look at the Old Testament, they really say that, God himself says, out of Egypt I brought my son, and I brought my nation. So the nation of Israel, they went in with Jacob and his sons. Joseph went into Egypt, and then they came out, and they were a great nation. And so, but all these models have nothing to do with that. They're trying to explain the origin of Israel apart from the Exodus. And that's why I call them non-conquest models. The first one was put out back in the early 20th century by a German scholar by the name of Albrecht Alt. It's called the peaceful infiltration model. The Peasant Revolt model in the 1960s by George Mendenhall. The model today is called the agricultural resettlement model. And essentially, all of these, basically, there's kind of a variation on the theme, but the core issue is that Israel, there was no people that came out of Egypt, but these were Canaanites that began to identify themselves as Israelites. That's the theory. The theory is that as they began to resettle into this area, what Finkelstein says is that Canaanite population was sort of, the self-identified Canaanites religiously were beginning to sort of wane away, and this new group sort of came in, and they began to resettle where the collapse of Canaanite culture was coming in, and they began to identify themselves as Israelites. So again, all of it's non-conquest models. So what are our options when we're looking at the Exodus? Well, literally, let me just tell you, cut to the chase, because I studied this for years, and I would challenge anybody to tell me if there's two other options. There's basically two options. There's what we call the early date and the late date. The early date, the late date would be 13th century, so around 1267, 1266 BC. That would put the conquest at 1220, which would mean Ramses II would be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, or the early date, which is in the 15th century. So 1446, which would place the Exodus sometime during the reign of Thutmose III or Amenhotep II. And this is based on chronology, based on just what we know about history, what we know about Egyptian history. So those are the two dating models. So let me just say, if this were a seminary class, or if this was an archaeology class, I'd basically say, you only have to, if you're going to hold to any semblance of a historical Exodus, there are your two models. Now, what we can do is, if you wanted to, we don't have the time to do this, because I'm going to defend the early view today, because I think that's where the best evidence lies. But there are scholars, evangelical scholars, who think that it's the late date. And a couple of them are actually at Wheaton, James Hoffmeyer and John Walton. I don't know if Walton does hold to the. I talked to him last year, actually, earlier this year. He was at a conference we gave, and actually came to one of my talks on the Canaanites. And I had John Walton in the back. I was like, oh, better be careful. No, I didn't. I was just going to tell what I thought was true. But I asked him afterwards, about the conquest, about the archaeology. He does all the stories behind it. But I asked him, I said, what's your view of the archaeology? He says, I don't even think we can know if there was a conquest. I'm like, really? Wow, interesting. I didn't say that. I was like, He didn't think we can know it as a conquest. He's concerned about the theological meaning of the creating sacred space. The lost world, Genesis 1. Well, he does that same. He uses that and now applies it to the conquest. So yeah, sacred space in the land. So, but archaeologically, Walton and others don't even think we can know there's a conquest. And I just want to raise my hand. Just look at the archaeology. You can just through the process of elimination, look at what's there. You could reject it later, but at least check it out and see if there's any kind of evidence that it's there. So here are a couple of points I want to make here at the beginning of why this is important. One of my favorite scholars in the 20th century, Dr. Edwin Thiel. Chronology is the backbone of history. If you want to find an event, you've got to know the right date. The date is important. And you say, well, how in the world can we know the date? And I'll explain how we do that in a moment. But chronology is the backbone of history. He wrote that in a book called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. That was his dissertation back in the 1950s, in which he reconciled Old Testament history with the ancient world. And at the heart of the debate in the Old Testament is chronology. So in the debate that scholars have, even among professional scholars, when you go to archaeological meetings, I know you guys are dealing a lot with science and physics here, but when you go to the equivalent meetings in archaeology, the things that archaeologists debate and get in arguments about are dating and chronology. Well, no, this date, no, that date, no, this date. And you make your case for the certain date. So that's what we're talking about today is my understanding of the best evidence for the early date. So the late date, let's talk about that real quick, and then we're going to make the case for the early date. The late date would place the Exodus at about 1266 or 1267 BC, based on references to the store cities of Pithom and Ramses in the Old Testament. So give me 1 second here. Let me pull my phone up so I can keep track of time here. I knew I would probably not have enough time to get through this, so there's just a huge subject, massive. Some problems, the store cities are anachronistic. Basically, the copies that we have of the Old Testament, they're referring back to, they're renaming, the cities took on a different name. There's a couple of different ways to resolve this issue. And the other one is Ramses II's reign is actually problematic for reconciling the biblical text. If you think there's any semblance of literality about the Old Testament, then Ramses II, he was the second. Well, actually, take it back. I think, if my memory serves me correctly, he was the longest reigning pharaoh who ever lived, 66 years. The only other guy who reigned longer than him was Thutmose III, who reigned for 54 years, and he would have been one of the Exodus pharaohs. But y'all explain how that works in a minute. But the other big problem is there's no conquest. So if you plug that date in, and then you account for a 40-year wilderness wandering, and then you go to Israel, and you look at the three key cities that you would expect to find in conquest: Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. Three major cities. Now, the rest of the cities were occupied, but there are three cities that the Old Testament says that the Israelites definitively destroyed, and it was Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. And guess what? We know where all three cities are. They've been excavated, and we have evidence that all three cities were destroyed exactly in the early dating scenario in the late Bronze Age. All three cities. We may not have time to get all of it, but I've got slides to show you if I can get to them. So, the Exodus. Hoffmeyer says this, and I absolutely agree with him here on this point. The events of the Exodus and Conquest stand or fall together. They stand or fall together. So, whatever view you're going to plant your flag in, if you're an early date guy, if you plant your flag in that date, then you've also got to defend that date in the Conquest. The same way if you hold to the late date. So if you're a late date, you say, well, no, I think it was in the late date. Great, fine, okay. Well, then tell me where the conquest is. Because we know where Jericho is. We've excavated down to bedrock at Jericho. Tel El Sotan. It's been excavated for 100 years now. So if you're going to plant your flag in the late date, then pray tell me where is the conquest. Because it ain't in the archaeological record. It's either it didn't exist or that's not Jericho. And that's not a consent. Nobody, I don't know of anybody who doesn't think that Tel El Sotan is not Jericho. I mean, not even the most liberal, godless scholar doesn't think that Tel El Sotan is Jericho. So I know I sound intense, But there's just no other way. I mean, if you're going to hold any kind of historical conquest, there's just no other option. You've got to have that. That's your view. Got to be your view. So internally in the text itself, the case for the early date, 1 Kings 6:1, the Exodus occurred 480 years prior to the laying of foundations of Solomon's temple. This took place in about 966 BC. So when you do the math, that places the Exodus, it would have placed the Exodus at about 1446 BC. This would have been during the time of the 18th dynasties of Pharaohs. And we know those Pharaohs. So to prefer a 1267 date, one would need to allegorize the 480 years referring to 1 Kings 6:1. Now, it may be that it's sort of an allegorical number, but again, you can plug in the dates in archaeology and see whether or not they fit and how they fit together. But a compelling argument, this is from Dr. Doug Petrovich, who's an Egyptologist. A compelling argument for choosing 1446 is that the Bible, the Jubilee cycles rather, agree with this date exactly, yet are completely independent of the 479 plus years of 1 Kings 6:1. The Jubilee dates are precise only if the priests began counting years when they entered the land in 1406 BC. This is in Leviticus 25. So apart from the 1 Kings 6:1 date, we also have the Jubilee cycles in which they began counting the years of Jubilees, and it also just independently confirms that the Exodus must have occurred sometime in 1446 BC. Also, the Maseretic text, and I don't have time to get into that whole argument, but there are some key dates in the Maseretic text. It's a textual tradition of Hebrew scribes in which they carefully recorded numbers. And so just a quick, do you guys know about the Maseretz? So the Maseretz, they had it was a scribal tradition in which when they were copying Old Testament manuscripts, literally what they're doing is they're counting the individual Hebrew letters. And so you got the original, or apparently the original, and you got a copy, and they would count the numbers or the letters, and if the number of the copy was off, they would tear it up and throw it away and start all over again. So what this meant was, where this all comes into play is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Isaiah scroll was copied through the Maseretz, which means it was 99.999% accurate. So that's 200 BC is the Isaiah scroll, so it matches your Old Testament Isaiah 99.999%. So that's where all these come in. What that means is the numbers that they recorded were accurate numbers. And if we plug those dates in, then we've got some dates here of a conquest. So beginning with the conquest and working backwards, we can see some key dates here for Israel and when they would have been in the land. And you can look at how all this relates together. But what we're interested in is the Exodus and the conquest. All right. Based on this date, Joseph went to Egypt sometime in about 1876 BC. This would have been the Pharaoh that Joseph and his brothers would have went. So 1876 BC, Sesostris III, he would have been the famine Pharaoh. And then Sesostris II would have been the abundance Pharaoh. And yes, somewhere in this, right in here, Joseph. So Sesostris II, the third rather. And guess what? We think we've got historical evidence for Joseph and the 12 brothers of Israel in Egypt. We'll get to in just a second. A lot of amazing stuff. The other problem with the late date is that the Merneptah stele, you got Israel in the land in 1213 BC. This is 10 foot high and 5 foot wide. And here's the inscription focused on is 1213 BC. Literally it says, Israel is laid waste and his seed is no more. In the Egyptian hieroglyphic, the determinative for people group was used for Israel. So if they're going to escape out of Egypt in 1267, why are they already there in Israel, established in the land by this Pharaoh Merneptah? So the chronology just doesn't make, the archaeology doesn't make sense, and that's there. So again, I'm kind of working through this because I want to get to some really cool stuff here. Here's the 18th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs. This places us in somewhere during the reign of Thutmose III or Amenhotep II. The first of those was Ahmose I. And then another very interesting person I'll talk about in a minute is the Queen Hatshepsut, who co-reigned with Thutmose III for about 22 years. Now, I don't know if you all have heard of any of this stuff, but based on the chronology, this is some good evidence. This is all circumstantial, but it's all historical inferences. It's very likely the case that Hatshepsut, She was a teenage girl in her father's, when she was growing up, and she would have found Moses in the Nile. And there's reasons why I say that. And I actually have a slide of her mummified face, if you'd like to see it in a minute. Hatshepsut. You say, well, how do you know it's Hatshepsut? Because her name was on the coffin, Hatshepsut. So, pretty amazing stuff. So this is like I was going through this last night, just kind of reviewing my notes. This is sort of like a Jerry Springer movie, with all these family interactions and stuff. But what I want to show you here is that Thutmose I had two wives. He had a primary wife and a secondary wife. So guys, don't get any ideas. But with his primary wife, Thutmose I was the third pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He had one daughter by the name of Hatshepsut. And with his secondary wife, he had a son named Thutmose II. So Hatshepsut and Thutmose, right there, they marry, and they have a daughter named Neferure. Okay? So then he has a second wife, Eset, and then they have a son named Thutmose III. Okay? So again, I don't have time to develop this, but I want to just tell you straight out that for historical considerations, it's very likely that Hatshepsut is the one who pulled Moses from the Nile. Moses could have very well known Thutmose III. So basically Hatshepsut, Thutmose, he basically married his half-sister, basically. So, but they co-reigned. Thutmose II actually died at a fairly young age, and Thutmose III was like a year old when his father died, and he was the next in line to be pharaoh. So Hatshepsut co-reigned with him for 22 years as co-pharaoh, and in fact, she was considered to be. James Henry Breasted, who is the founder of the Oriental Institute Museum in Chicago here, said that Hatshepsut is one of the great women that we know about from history. And she built incredible, incredible things in archaeology and in history. And I'll show you some in just a second. But anyway, Thutmose III and Satia, his primary wife, had Amenemhat, who was his firstborn, and he died. And then they had Amenhotep II. Okay, so Amenhotep II, for our consideration, is the pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, what was the 10th plague? The 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. He's not the firstborn. He didn't die in the plague. Okay, and his oldest son does not succeed him as pharaoh, but his second or third son succeeds him. Because, in fact, there's so much. It's like I told you, there's a whole lot here. Let me get to Hatshepsut. One of my favorite things she built was her mortuary temple in the Valley of the Kings, a place called Deir el-Bahari. It is absolutely stunningly amazing. Even the Greeks were amazed at this. And it's huge entrance into the side of a mountain. It's where her coffin was. Well, they moved it later, but it's just absolutely remarkable. But you can see the dates of her reigns there. This is a closer up picture. So if you go to Egypt today in the Valley of the Kings, you walk up these steps. I mean, isn't that amazing? That's like 3,000 years old. And you think about the grandeur of this architecture, this amazing buildings that she did. This is Thutmose III, who is the younger, and there's Hatshepsut, and there they are together. This is on one of the pylons at Luxor, which is near Thebes on the Nile. And so a reason I show you this slide is to show you that Thutmose III, again, that was his stepmother and his aunt, really. It's kind of weird. Like I said, it's a Jerry Springer kind of thing. But she was the one to reign, and she built these incredible building projects. She presented herself as a pharaoh. I mean, she was just ahead of her time in so many ways. But she was probably one of the most powerful monarch queens in the ancient world. You can read about her. She's fascinating. But the reason I want to show you this slide is that they were friends. I mean, he did not think bad of her. He didn't think bad of her, which this will come into play in just a minute. So keep that in mind. This is Thutmose III, who is, so this is when he gets older. When she dies, then he becomes, well, first, as they're co-reigning, Hatshepsut places Thutmose III in charge of her army. So he is the army. He does 17 campaigns into Palestine. He is this incredible warrior. And there he is, smoting his enemies. This is on again on one of the pylons at Karnak and Luxor. He is considered to be, by all historical accounts, he was the Napoleon of Egypt. He was a great conqueror. He was an amazing guy. And so he is the father of Amenhotep II, who is the pharaoh of the Exodus. All right. So this is his obelisk. This is actually was brought to Constantinople by the Byzantine Roman Emperor Theodosius I in 390. It was cut in 3 sections, and it's placed there in Istanbul, Turkey. So if you go to Istanbul, you can see part of his obelisk there standing today. Did he know Moses? Very likely. This is another statue of him, I believe, from the British Museum. He was very likely raised by Hatshepsut, and he would have known Moses. Now, in the Bible, what's that? Oh, he does. Oh, yeah. And the Bible says that when Moses, and there's, of course, you got to look at Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7, and you also look at the account in Exodus. And between these two accounts, what we see is that when Moses fled, remember he murdered an Egyptian, and he fled out in the desert, went to Midian for 40 years. And then Stephen's account says that the Pharaoh died, and then he came back to Egypt. Well, it was Thutmose III that died, and then Amenhotep II is the guy. So while there would have been animosity very likely between Moses and Thutmose III, because his stepmother, here he was, this Semite, this Jew, and his stepmother Hatshepsut brought him into the royal household and raised him. So if Moses murdered an Egyptian, he would have fled to Midian because of Thutmose III. But because he died, here's the problem. If the scenario were applied to Ramses II, Ramses reigned for 66 years, so it couldn't work. He would still be alive because it says that after 40 years in the desert, he came back, and that doesn't work except nobody else but Thutmose III. That dating scenario, only worked. Hopefully you're following my logic here. But in any case, that's the guy we're looking at is the one who died, and then his son, Amenhotep II, is the one that Moses would have actually stood before. So there is a statue of Hatshepsut. The next picture I'm going to show you, now if you don't want to look at this, you don't have to. It's kind of gross. That's not gross. That's an artist rendition. You got the great view here. But the next picture I want to show you, if you would like to see it, you can. If you don't, you can turn your eyes, and I'll count down in 3, 2, 1. But this is actually her mummified face of the lady who very likely pulled Moses from the Nile. So here we go. 3, 2, 1. And there she is. And she's got a smile. She's actually got a smile. She's got hair. Yeah, isn't it remarkable? It's quite remarkable. What's that? What's that? What about? That's real hair. Yes, absolutely. These little things in her nostrils. No, that's actually some of the chemicals from the mummification process. One of the things that the Egyptians would do is they would place natron in the body. So they would have these little cotton bags, and it would totally desiccate the body. And in addition to that, they would also put salt and sand on it, so it really dried out. And then after it dried out, then they rubbed it with honey and all kinds of resins and oils and things like that. So that is Hatshepsut, pretty remarkable. Now here's the amazing thing. Sometime after the time of Amenhotep II and the Exodus, when the Exodus occurred, all of Hatshepsut's images, somebody orders them to be torn off of Egypt, all erased. And here's an example. Not just here, but all throughout Egypt. In fact, they didn't get them all because in her mortuary temple, and one of the back sides of the columns, they had her name. So Egyptian names would be in cartouches. So these little round cylindrical things that had the name. So somebody didn't chisel out. And that's significant because Egyptologists today even debate, was it Thutmose III who erased her image, or was it Amenhotep II? Who do you think it was? Based on what we know of the Exodus. Who would have had reason to erase her image? Amenhotep II. Because Thutmose, that was his stepmother, and earlier we saw him with her together at Karnak, but now she's erased. Why would that be? Because he brought in these Hebrew slaves, and they defeated the Egyptian gods. There's a whole lot more that I've got. So Amenhotep II, let me just say this about him. His father, Thutmose III, does 17 campaigns. He only does 4 or 5. And then after the 9th year of his reign, he doesn't go anywhere. In fact, where he based his residence, most of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty had their residence in the south in Thebes. Amenhotep II had his residence in Memphis. Now, not Memphis, Tennessee. He wasn't eating barbecue. But that would have placed him near Goshen, which would have given him access to Moses and Aaron. And what we're going to see in a moment, as well is this area right here, Avaris, Tel El Daba, and I believe this is where the Israelites were located. What is this? So here is a map, satellite imagery. There is Egypt there. You can see the Nile as it flows out. This is the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Gulf of Suez. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. This is the Jordan Rift Valley that goes up through Israel, and that's the Dead Sea. But typically people place Mount Sinai right in there in the Sinai Peninsula. We're talking earlier. My own view, I think Midian was over here, and this is in Saudi Arabia, actually. Midian is the Hebrew where they were. This is not Midian. This is Midian, all up in here. So if Mount Sinai was in Midian, it's got to be over here. So we can talk about that afterwards. There's so many little rabbit trails we could go on. So let's focus on Avaris, Tel El Daba. This is biblical Ramses, the Nile Delta where Jacob and his family moved in 1876 BC. It's on the Nile Delta as it flows out into the Mediterranean on the eastern branch called the Plusaric branch. It's been excavated by an Austrian archaeologist by the name of Manfred B. Tack for about 30 years. And Manfred B. Tack found a remarkable city. So you see at the Delta, it's very lush, but they got to go down into bed. These are called balks. So archaeologists will leave a section of the dirt so they can actually see the stratigraphy as they dig down. But what I want to show you is this is a really cool graphic. This is from Patterns of Evidence. If you've seen that video, Patterns of Evidence, this is from that. But you've got Avaris over here in Ramses. So it actually had the name of Ramses too. So that also solves the problem that the cities of Pithom and Ramses were here at Avaris. This is where the Israelites would have been located. This is where Jacob and his family would have lived. And the archaeologist B. Tack found a huge 540-hectare city, miniature city that was actually indwelt by Semites, by Jews. Well, we don't know if they were Jews. We know they were Asiatic. They were non-Egyptian. So, and then it becomes barren in about 1446 BC. In fact, one specific area, in fact, there are different areas, but the area that B. Tack identified as the military garrison, where he based his military forces, it becomes barren. Gee, I wonder why. And that also coincides with the 9th year of the reign of Amenhotep II. So all the arrows are pointing to Amenhotep II, the 9th year of his reign, at his city, at his city of where his military forces were located. That layer becomes abandoned in the 9th year of his reign, and it becomes a pastoral sheep burial. This is from B. Tack's report here. So really remarkable. At the same city, there is discovered this incredible tomb. It was a pyramidal tomb, central, and guess what was around it? 11 other tombs. 11 other tombs, and the big one was in the middle, and this statue was in here. Some scholars believe this is actually Joseph himself. And they excavated in the tomb, and there was no coffin. No coffin. And what do we know? That's a statue. That's right. This is found in Goshen. Several limestone fragments were discovered from the statue of a non-Egyptian Asiatic man excavated in 1991 and reconstructed from the southeast section of Cemetery F1. You can read the phase. The destruction of the statue, if Joseph, is predictable given the destruction of Egypt during the Exodus. Deliberate chisel marks on the head and the eye socket are visible. This is consistent with the erasure of Hatshepsut from images since she adopted Moses.
Angry with the Jews, so
they're going to destroy their stuff. Absolutely. And this is an artistic rendition of what that would have looked like. The statue was found in this room right here, and that's what it would have looked like based on artistic reconstruction. So Joseph, and he has a little stick in his hand, which indicates he has authority. This person has great authority in Egypt, even though he's an Asiatic, he's a non-Egyptian, but he has great authority. This is a statue right here. That's what it looks like. Now we know the Israelites moved him and his bones, and he ended up in the Promised Land. And I, by the grace of the Lord, got to go to the site. It's in today modern-day Shechem in the West Bank in Nablus. And in 2014, I actually got to go stand right there. This is now known as a cenotaph. Joseph's body would have lain right in that area. There's good archaeological and historical evidence that not now, because there's no bones or anything. And most scholars today believe he's moved further up into Israel. I'm going to wrap it up here in just a minute. Are we good? You want to do Q&A, right? Keep going? He's telling me I'm on a time limit. So let me show you this. This is so cool, okay? So let me get back up. I don't want to jump the gun here. So I'll wrap. This is a good segue to wrap this up. This is a good little bow to tie on it, and I'll open for Q&A here because there's just a ton of stuff here. But several years ago in the Sinai Peninsula, you know that satellite image picture I showed you of the Sinai. So in that Sinai Peninsula, there the Egyptians actually were mining turquoise. They're turquoise mines, and they would use turquoise in their jewelry. You've seen a lot of the gold jewelry with the blue stone, and they apparently put the Asiatics that were living at Avaris in charge of these turquoise mines, and they were going there and they were leaving these inscriptions, and they're known as the Serabit El Khadim inscriptions, and they're some kind of language that actually looks like Hebrew. In fact, it looks like a cross between Hebrew and hieroglyphics. And there is a new theory that's come on the scene just in the past 2 years, and it has caused a whirlwind of controversy. And it's by Dr. Doug Petrovich. And Dr. Petrovich is an Egyptologist. Just so you know where he got it. He got his PhD from the University of Toronto, and his PhD work was in Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics. So we're not talking about just some guy who has a wild theory. He's written a book on it called The World's First Alphabet, and what he theorizes, and he's got the arguments to back it up, based on these inscriptions, he has figured out where Hebrew came from. Hebrew came out of Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was a combination. It's the first alphabetic language. David Roll, the Egyptologist who is in the Patterns of Evidence, theorizes that it was Joseph, the vizier of Egypt. He would have been a Hebrew. He would have been the one to really create this, and they used it. Now, here's the amazing thing. The language is found in the Sinai Peninsula on these inscriptions. And then after the Exodus, guess what? It moves into Israel. It disappears. You don't see it again in the archaeological record in Egypt, and it moves up into Israel where we see it as Proto-Hebrew. That's remarkable. But there's more. You get more. There's more Ginsu knives. Dr. Petrovich has done some translations of these things, and guess what he has discovered? He has discovered the name of Moses and the name of the Hebrews, and here is one of them. I was actually there at ETS several years ago when he broke this to the scholarly world. 6 Levantines, Hebrews of Bethel the Beloved. And there he is, Hebedeb, on the back of a donkey. These are Asiatics. Isn't that remarkable? Basically, the inscription names the Hebrews as being from this. The word there is Levantine is the word, the land of retinue, is literally the Hebrew transliteration. Hebrews called Israel the land of retinue. So he translates this as Levantine. So the Levant is that area along the Mediterranean that goes from Syria, where the Golan Heights are, all the way down into the southern part of Israel. That whole area is called the Levant, but the Egyptians called it retinue. So that's why Petrovich translates it as 6 Levantines. Hebrews of Bethel. That's where Jacob came from. They're from Bethel. But there's more. Isn't this remarkable? There is the chart in his book in which he shows how the language, it goes from pictograph all the way over into the Hebrew alphabet and how they're connected. And scholars are just up in arms. Their objections are against this. They say, well, he's wrong about this, he's wrong about that. But underneath the undercurrent, let's just call the elephant in the room, what they're really protesting is that he has the audacity to say that the Israelites were in Egypt, that this came out of the Israelites. Because they categorically reject the historical Exodus. So that's really what's fueling their hatred against Petrovich, I think. So that's the chart. You want to get the book. The book is like $80. You can get it. It's Carta in Jerusalem. It's called The World's First Alphabet, and you can get it on there. So
why is there that emotional rejection?
Because I know you might find this surprising, but scholars can be prideful sometimes and hard-headed. No, and there's existential stuff too. I mean, some of them probably do believe he's genuinely wrong, but they are just very arrogant. They think that they just have their views.
Is part of it has to do with Egyptology, dating of pottery, things of that gives you a different dating process?
That's a whole complex question. So the dating, there's a whole another discussion about that. But there's something called the Ebers Papyrus. And the Ebers Papyrus mentions the Sothic. So this is called a historical synchronism, in which we have, because you wonder, well, how in the world do you get that date for that pharaoh? Well, one really good historical synchronism in Egyptology is called the Ebers Papyrus, in which it mentions the heliacal rising of the Sothic dog star. Now, we know astronomy, and astronomy is based on math and Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Now you can go. There's software programs now that you can go to anywhere in the world, punch in the number, look at the sky, what it looked like 1,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and you come up with a date. And so that papyrus gives a really firm date of these 18th dynasty pharaohs. So we know those dates are pretty solid. I mean, there's a lot of debate, but that one's a pretty solid one of these connections. So here's the Wadi Nasib Sarabit El Khadim, and literally, here's the Moses description. Our bound servitude lingered. Moses then provoked astonishment at the year of the lady. This was found in 1446 this is the 361 Sarabit El Khadim. There's another one found at Wadi El Hol, and then right here as well at the Turquoise Mine.
This is all on your website?
This is actually, yes, some of this on the website. This is actually in the article that we wrote on the top 10 archaeological discoveries of the Old Testament. So it's on the blog. And also, Lord willing, I'm really busy in the next couple of months, but I'm going to interview Doug Petrovich on my blog, Monocle and Spade, in which we're going to dig into this a lot deeper. So stay tuned. But Monocle and Spade is my, what's that? I have a podcast. We only had 2 episodes. We just launched it just a couple months ago. We interviewed Scott Stripling and Shelley Neese about the Copper Scroll. So the next one we're going to interview is Dr. Doug Petrovich, who wrote this book. So stay tuned to the podcast to learn more about that. All right. Yeah. I'll stop there because there's just, I mean, do you tell me, what do you...
I would rather let it open up to
Yeah.
the